We know that the Taiping rebels did achieve military success to a very large extent. And that military success was based on overwhelming support of the Chinese people. And in fact, initially it was definitely truly a people's war which released the creativity of the masses, unleashed the initiative of the masses. And they adopted social and political program. That was the most constructive part of it. They did not simply rebel or fought against the Manchus. They also did constructive work, development work. And in fact, the principles which they advocated or the revolution measures which they carried through contain many elements, new elements, which denoted a direct break with the ancient Chinese tradition of peasant rebellions. It was these new elements which made Taiping rebellion stand apart from many previous peasant rebellions. And in fact, the Taiping rebellion gave inspiration to Sun Yat-sen, to Kuomintang, and also the leaders of the May 4th movement of 1919, and of course the communists also. As for example, as Wolfgang Frank writes, the Taipings took over the idea of equality of all men from Christianity. And this idea combined with many ancient ideas and did much to strengthen their revolutionary program. And let us now turn to the very briefly to the revolutionary measures which they adopted. First is common property. Under the Taipings, unlike what we find in the previous regimes, there was no private possession. There should be no private possession. They established a common treasury and a common granary from which provision was made for individual weddings, baths, funerals, or for any other public purpose. Second is a land reform program, most important part. In place of the concentration of land ownership in the hands of the landlords or the scholar officials, the makers of the new order proclaimed an egalitarian agrarian law. And they declared that all the land under heaven should be cultivated by all the people under heaven. Let them cultivate it together. That was their declaration in the agrarian law. And all the land was divided into 9 categories according to its quality and was allocated for the use of the population. And the peasants retained only that part of the produce for himself that was needed for his own subsistence. Taxes were reduced to a level which was lower than demanded by the Manchus. They proclaimed that in a rebel state, there should be no person who is not well fed and well clad. It was a clearly anti-feudal program. Abolition of feudalism and the distribution of land among the landless peasants or poor peasants. The third is the position of women, which is also very important. In traditional Chinese society, women had always been, they had a subordinate position and they did not have any right over property. They did not have any say over family affairs or public affairs. Now the Taipings made a qualitative departure from this situation, from the past. And they sought to tear apart the ropes and create a new society based on equality between men and women. A feudal society where women did not enjoy any rights whatsoever. They forbade prostitution and the purchase and sale of women in marriage. They declared that all men and women are equal. Now, this undoubtedly was an act of revolutionary significance in the context of 19th century China. And in the rebel order, women could sit for state examinations and occupy same civil and military positions as those of men. And one remarkable feature is the existence of women's units in the Taiping army, rebel army. Monogamy was made obligatory. Rape was punishable by death. And a marriage ceremony similar to the Western system of church wedding was introduced. Temperance. Like tobacco and alcohol, opium was strictly prohibited, and this was also enforced in practice. It was a clearly anti-foreign, anti-imperialist in character. Then we have attack on images. The Taipings were monotheistic, and their activities showed signs of, in a sense, of their intolerance towards other religious sects. They were influenced by Christianity, Protestantism. They were opposed to the Catholics, but they were pro-Protestant in one sense. Hung Xiuquan himself was a Christian. He adopted Christianity. They were influenced by Christianity. They destroyed images, statues and temples of Buddhism, Confucianism and even Taoism. And it is pertinent to point out here that attacks on the Confucian tablets or Confucian structures only betrayed their anti-feudal feeling, because Confucianism was very much part and parcel of the feudal society of China, because it was Confucian ideology which sustained the feudal system for nearly 2,500 years. Then we have the treatment of foreigners. The Taipings recognize none of the privileges extracted by the foreign powers. To them, everyone was equal. Yes, they did not regard them as superior, so that all men from afar are barbarians. No, all are equal. Relationship should be based on equality among all. And they were also fairly alive to the challenge of the West, the new Western designs. Then we have the calendar reform. The traditional Chinese calendar was a lunar calendar that was based on the movement of the moon. The Taipings introduced a completely new calendar which represented a combination of both solar and lunar elements with a 7-day week like the Western system. Then we have the literary reform, important one. They also introduced important changes in the written language of the people. The Chinese language did not have any alphabet. It is ideographic. Still now there is no alphabet. And there was wide variety in dialect. Hunanese dialect is one, Cantonese dialect is another. Despite such differences, the written language was the same everywhere. Unlike our country, written language was the same everywhere, and that despite disunity in other fields, it was this which could hold the Chinese nation together, because the language, written language, was the same everywhere, be it in Hunan or in Canton or in, let us say, Sichuan or Shenxi or in any other part of China. But the problem was that overwhelming majority of the Chinese people did not know the written language, because it is very difficult to get into the Chinese language, simply because there was no alphabet. We have only characters and no alphabet. That is the reason. And so the problem was to make the written language come closer to the colloquial speech. That was very important. The Taipings made an attempt in this direction. They relaxed the heavily conventional written style, which was quite different from the spoken language, by approximating it more closely to the colloquial speech. So in this sense, they were precursors to the Mayfort movement reformers, who also did the same, attempted the same. Now, the Taiping Rebellion, as you know, took place at a time when the Chinese society had been undergoing a process of transition from a feudal society to a semi-feudal and semi-colonial one. And it started roughly from the time of the Opium Wars, when the foreign powers started encroaching into China, extracted privileges, etc. Israel Epstein, in his book From Opium War to Liberation, holds that this rebellion was at the same time the last of our old-style peasant wars and the first great democratic fight of our people in a modern period. So it combined elements of both the old style and the new style. The French historian Chenot says that elements of proto-nationalism in the Taiping movement linked it with the peasant rebellions of the earlier days. The Taiping rebels accused the Manchus of wanting to drain the country of its wealth. One important nationalist element here was that The Taipings allowed their hair to grow on the front part of the head, a custom which was disallowed under the Manchus. Under the Manchus, they did not allow the hair to grow on the front part, but the Taipings introduced it. During the meantime, it was there. The Manchu disallowed it, but they reintroduced it. And this explains why such a large number of educated people, rich people, also joined it, because they were influenced by anti-Manchu patriotic feelings. That was there. So they also joined. They joined not out of social reasons, but out of national reasons, nationalistic reasons. Mao Zedong wrote on the significance of the Chinese peasant rebellions. He pointed out that Chinese peasant rebellions constituted a unique feature in the history of China, which made China stand apart from other countries. But because of the absence of correct leadership, such as the proletariat and the Communist Party, peasant wars of the past were unable to liberate the country from the feudal yoke. And while speaking of the Taiping Rebellion, Mao pointed out that the Taiping War was one of the 8 major events that occurred in a formative period of the China's bourgeois democratic revolution. So Taiping Rebellion was one of the greatest peasant rebellions in the history of China. It failed for reasons that had led to the miscarriage of many other rebellions in the past. Yes, the rebels wanted to set up an equalitarian utopian society. They had a utopian vision, no doubt. And their reforms were actually of a character as to pave the way to capitalism. However, the productive forces in China at that time were still not ripe for such a social change to take place, for such a social transformation. Mao Zedong wrote that peasant uprisings and peasant wars in China had no parallel anywhere else. But because there were no new productive forces and new relations of production, nor any advanced political party or political program, every peasant rebellion failed to attain the goal, and the peasantry was used by the landlords and the nobility only to bring about dynastic changes. So these were utilized to bring about dynastic changes simply because the situation was not ripe for such a social revolution or basic social transformation.
Why was there such a huge women participation in the Taiping Rebellion, so much that there was a separate women's unit in the revolutionary military outfit?
One reason probably, which has been suggested by Shelo, is that it was the breakup of the Chinese families in the countryside. Breakup of the Chinese families as a result of the feudal crisis in China. That explains such large-scale participation of women in peasant rebellions in many parts. That is one. There is another suggestion coming from another historian. According to her, Julia Kristeva is her name. Pirates joined it because as a result of Confucianism was very much patriarchal, masculine, patriarchal. Taoism, another important philosophy, which also exercised sufficient influence on the Chinese population right from the second century, right from the days of Confucius. Same, more or less, arose in the same period, 6th century, 5th century BC. That was the period, or something later, somewhat later. Now, Taoism was very much pro-women. And Kristeva says that it was the Taoist areas which allowed women relative freedom, more freedom, no doubt. And so since women were free in the Taoist areas rather than in the Confucian areas, so it was that freedom which helped them to protest, to protest against injustice, and to join the rebel ranks. So it was all these factors, the socio-economic reason, and their response to the breakdown of the family system in the countryside, as also the freedom which they enjoyed in some areas, which explains the large-scale participation of women in the peasant rebellions.
Section of the rebel leaders set up a bureaucratic state in Nanking, somewhat similar to the one they wanted to overthrow. So my question is, sir, is this failing bound to are such failings bound to impede all social revolutions in all ages in history?
It is one case. It can happen, but the fact is that it happened because since all of them were coming from the old society, they had been coming with the old ideas. It is not easy. It takes time to fight against oneself, to fight against himself. It's an internal fight. You are fighting against someone, some forces, which of course you rightly consider to be oppressive forces, and you want to create a new society. But since old ideas are very much, you are not totally free from the old ideas, so it can happen that you will have to, you can get influenced even when you have set up a new order. And in fact, that is the reason why Mao thought about the cultural revolution. Even when we have a new social order, we have a new socialist society, there is a need for a new cultural revolution, because the need for change in the superstructure is very much important. So, of course, that did not take place. So old ideas remain, and it was their failure to combat old ideas and to imbibe new, and to get oneself enriched with new ideas, that probably explains why they moved in opposite direction after some years.
What was the attitude of the different imperialistic power towards the Taiping Revolution?
When the Taiping Rebellion started, initially the foreign powers did not intervene. They were observing. They were assessing the Chinese situation. And since the Taiping Rebellion was basically anti-Manchu, Hung Xiuqian himself was a Christian, he was advocating something which is progressive, they welcomed it. But later on, when they realized that the Taiping Rebellion would not come to their help, it would also go against them, because they had been introducing measures which were also anti-foreign, not just anti-Manchu or anti-feudal, but which were also anti-foreign, anti-imperialist. They were very much anti-opium. So when they realized this, it was after that they intervened in defense of the Manchu state, and many troops from many countries, thousands of troops from many countries, they adopted an anti-Taiping attitude and directly, militarily got themselves involved in crushing the Taiping Rebellion. So far we have dealt with the background, the cause, the revolutionary measures, and the significance of the Taiping Rebellion. This Taiping Rebellion, which took place from 1851 to 1864, has been acclaimed as one of the greatest of the Chinese peasant rebellions, and it was of course the greatest of rebellions in the modern history of China.